Welcome back, friends of Reformed history and lovers of pastoral discipline. Today we are in Chapter 3 of Geoffrey Watt's The Consistory and Social Discipline in Calvin's Geneva. A chapter delightfully titled, Educating and Disciplining the Young. Though Watt might have been tempted to subtitle it, How to Raise a Child with a Rod and a Catechism. Now, before we panic, yes, there are whippings in 16th century Geneva, but this isn't their version of the Hunger Games. We'll go through section by section. There's 8 in this chapter, with a touch of Reformed clarity and just a dash of skeptical side-eye at Geoffrey Watt's modern discomfort with the 16th century. First section is on baptism. We begin at the font. The Consistory took baptism very seriously, not as a magical rite, but as an entrance into the covenant community. Geneva didn't deny baptism to children based on their names, but if you presented a baby named after some medieval miracle worker, you would expect a pastoral eyebrow raise. And if your godparents still had a shrine to St. Anthony at home, you might find yourself politely but firmly corrected. Watt seems faintly horrified by how seriously they took baptism, but to Calvin and company, this was no cultural ornament. It was obedience to Christ. Naming your child St. Francis wouldn't cancel the baptism, but it would probably earn you a reminder that Geneva was no longer part of the cult of saints. As Watt admits in the early years, quote, Calvin and his colleagues were most concerned about eliminating papist vestiges, as seen in their attention to baptism and the naming of children, unquote. The Reformers viewed such naming practices not as quaint traditions, but as traces of the old superstitions that needed purging from the new Geneva. They were not creating a society of dour Puritans. They were replanting the covenant community in good soil. The second section, the religious education of children. From baptism straight into catechism class, the pastors of Geneva saw catechism as essential, to use Watt's word, indoctrination, which sounds ominous until you remember it's literally teaching your kids what they believe. In Calvin's Geneva, skipping catechism wasn't a youthful phase, it was a disciplinary offense. Watt notes how the consistory chased down families who neglected this, but from a Reform view, it wasn't a crackdown, it was care for their souls. Catechesis was how you taught a generation to not grow up thinking Jesus was a nice moral teacher who wore sandals and talked about self-esteem. As Watt concedes, quote, the principal means of religious education in Geneva were the sermon and catechism, unquote. And the consistory bore the responsibility of ensuring that its residents were attending church and learning the catechism. The goal was not to create theologians, but worshipers who knew their Redeemer and their duties. Geneva wasn't training future inquisitors. It was building a literate and confessional church. Gasp. One child at a time. Section 3, conflicts over the catechism. Yes, some people resisted the catechism, as they do today, usually those still pining for the smells and bells of Rome. Watt frames this as a bit of a culture war, and it probably was, but if you're rebuilding the city on truth, there's no room for half-hearted allegiance. So when people skipped catechism or mocked the pastors, the consistory said, quote, how about you meet us Tuesday at 9 a.m. at church court? It wasn't a persecution, it was pastoral correction, just with a fewer lattes and more public admonitions. Watt notes that, quote, those with strong Catholic sympathies had long since succumbed or departed by the late 1540s, allowing the consistory to be more invasive and demand full compliance. He casts this as a power move. We would probably call it pastoral follow-through. When salvation is at stake, one doesn't shrug at parental negligence or teenage sarcasm. Section 4, the secular education of children. Watt, seemingly grudgingly, admits that Geneva promoted literacy, especially among boys. That's right, Reformed Geneva, long before the Enlightenment, was publishing education not for upward mobility, but so children could read their Bibles without getting distracted by TikTok. Of course, girls didn't receive equal education, which we can and should critique, but Calvin wasn't anti-intellectual, he was pro-discipleship, and if that meant your kid had to learn Latin and theology, so be it. Watt notes, quote, with its defense of mandatory schooling, the consistory was also contributing to more literate and better educated population, especially among males, unquote. This was not just social reform, it was a theological imperative. Calvin knew that truth had to be taught and that ignorance was not a virtue. The reformers wanted to create not only informed citizens, but catechized saints. Section 5, the schools and discipline. Now comes the part where modern readers wince. Corporal punishment in schools. Yes, kids got spanked. No, it wasn't Geneva's attempt at child abuse. I was raised in the early 80s in a school that spanked kids. I got spanked quite regularly by my principal and teachers. But by modern standards, it's, I'm sure, horrifying. Watt seems scandalized that the consistory gave schoolmasters permission to whip troublemakers, but let's be honest, if you've ever taught middle school boys, you might sympathize with Geneva's pastors. The real shock is that discipline was integrated with discipleship. The goal wasn't humiliation, it was correction. And in a world where sin wasn't seen as a developmental hiccup, discipline made sense. As Watt describes, quote, the consistory actually wielded greater authority in dealing with youths than adults. And like parents and teachers, the consistory could subject Genevan youths to whippings without the permission of the small court, unquote. In June 1566, Claude Bouchier was whipped at the college for stealing money to buy a knife and some purses. The modern reader may gasp, but Geneva saw this as soul care. Section 6, disciplining the young and generational conflicts. This section reads like a reform version of Judge Judy. Parents who beat too hard, called in. Parents who didn't discipline enough, also called in. Watt documents how the consistory aimed for balance, and while he subtly implies a kind of creeping authoritarianism, the reformed response is simpler. Authority is a gift when it's wielded justly. The pastors weren't power hungry. They were shepherds trying to prevent both cruelty and chaos, like actual pastors. For example, Watt recounts the case of George Augier, who, quote, freely admitted to whipping a servant girl 6 days in a row, unquote. Well, the consistory found this excessive, even by 16th century standards, and referred him to the small council. But in contrast, when a young apprentice skipped church, his master was instructed to punish him in the presence of consistory members. This wasn't inconsistency, it was calibration. Section 7, parental neglect. Now we get to the tragic cases. Mothers who left babies unattended, wet nurses who co-slept and accidentally smothered infants, and the consistory trying to navigate poor widows and dangerous customs and limited housing. To Watt's credit, he doesn't hide the sorrow here. He often interprets Geneva's discipline through a punitive lens. From a reform viewpoint, though, these were attempts at public justice and private mercy. Reprimands weren't cruelty, they were wake-up calls. Geneva believed the moral order mattered, even for infants. Watt writes of one mother who locked her 5-year-old and infant in a room. Quote, when the mother returned, she discovered that the cradle had tipped over, resulting in the baby's death. Unquote. The consistory demanded repentance, not merely punishment. In another case, the widow Gonnet was found drunk again, endangering her child. She was excluded from the supper and referred to the council with a recommendation that she be made to, quote, drink some water. A euphemism that Watt interprets as water torture, as like an early form of waterboarding. I don't think there's evidence to support that. I would love to see it. He doesn't give it. Regardless, punishment could be harsh, but it was driven by concern for the kids. Section 8, the moral supervision of children and youths. And this is the awkward part. Inappropriate sleeping arrangements. Children behaving indecently, and a teacher joking about thinking of Theodore Beza during conception. Watt reports these with both fascination and his less than subtle judgment. The real issue for Geneva wasn't scandal, it was scandalizing. Children were to be protected, guided, and yes, sometimes whipped if they were practicing bedroom theology with their siblings. Calvin's Geneva believed holiness was for all ages. Watt recounts, quote, 4 women testified about seeing a brother and sister, aged 7 and 5 respectively, playing together nude in a lascivious manner, unquote. The mother was ordered to bring them to the hospital to be whipped with rods. And then there's Bresson, the tutor who said girls should think of a handsome man during conception, and so she suggested thinking of Beza. The consistory was not amused. Quote, for her scandalous words and actions, Bresson was sentenced to a whipping and then banished from the city, unquote. Yeah, I wouldn't want her teaching my kids. So, conclusion. Watt wraps this chapter up, noting the consistory's increasing boldness and intervention, especially among the youth. He marvels, a little too uneasily perhaps, at how the consistory handed out whippings and withheld the supper and summoned children to account for themselves. To modern ears, it sounds harsh, as does any form of discipline or accountability. But to Reformed ears, it sounds like people who actually believed in original sin. Geneva's pastors weren't overstepping, they were standing in the breach. As Watt writes, quote, Calvin and his colleagues on the consistory viewed their role as that of fathers to the rest of society, unquote. And they believed that, quote, humans tainted by original sin were more inclined to do evil than good, unquote. Shocking, I know, unless you've read Romans 3 and you believe it's true. Well, that's it for chapter 3. Thanks for watching. Next up is chapter 4. That's where things get even more interesting. Spoiler, it involves young lovers, fornication, and church court. Calvin's Geneva, come for the theology, stay for the drama. If you've enjoyed this little walkthrough, like, subscribe, they're free today, and join us as we keep exploring the Reformed past, one disciplined Genevan youth at a time.